This is the brief on assault and disobedience to persons in authority. We're basically looking at Articles 148 through 152 of the Revised Penal Code. This is where we find out exactly when getting physical with or just ignoring a public officer crosses the line into a specific crime. All right, first up, direct assault. This happens two ways: using force for seditious aims or attacking a public official on duty. Now, here's the crucial part. Who you attack really matters. If it's a person in authority, like a mayor, even a light slap counts. But for an agent, say a police officer, the force has to be serious and dangerous. A simple push just won't be enough. Second, let's define our terms. A person in authority isn't just a politician. Surprisingly, this also covers teachers, professors, and lawyers while they're actually working. Agents are more what you'd expect: police officers, sheriffs, people in charge of public order. And finally, there's indirect assault and disobedience. Indirect assault is when you attack a private citizen who comes to help an officer. And disobedience, that's for things like ignoring a lawful order from an agent, as long as the resistance isn't serious enough to be called assault. So whether it's slapping a municipal president or ignoring a subpoena, the severity of the crime all depends on who the victim is and if they were on the clock. Knowing the legal difference between a slap and a shove can change everything.
You've seen them, right? Those viral videos of heated arguments with the police or a local official. But here in the Philippines, when does just speaking your mind cross a line and become an actual crime? Let's unpack the specific laws, because the line is way finer than you might think. And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not just about what you do, it's about who you do it to. And as you'll see, the law makes some really surprising distinctions that honestly, everyone should probably know about.
Okay, so before we even get into what counts as assault, we first have to figure out who the law is actually designed to protect, and it breaks them down into two main groups. First up, we've got what's called a person in authority. Now, you can think of this as the highest level of protection. The key phrase to remember here is vested with jurisdiction. All that really means is they have the direct legal power to govern and make sure laws are followed in their area.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Look who's on this list. Sure, you've got your Brendan Gay captains, that makes sense, but the law also considers teachers, professors, and even lawyers who are just doing their jobs as persons in authority. That means they get a whole extra layer of legal protection. All right, so that's the first group. The second category is an agent of a person in authority. Now, their job is super specific. It's all about keeping the peace, maintaining public order, and protecting people and property. These are the frontliners, the boots on the ground. And yeah, this list is pretty wide-ranging. You've got the obvious ones like police officers, but look, municipal treasurers and even agents from the BIR on here. And here's a really crucial detail you should catch. Any regular person, any citizen who steps in to help an authority figure is, for that moment, considered an agent. They get the exact same legal protection. Okay, so now we know who is protected. Let's get into the main event. What is direct assault? This is all laid out in Article 148 of the Revised Penal Code. So the law actually gives us two different ways this crime can be committed. The first one on the left, that's kind of like rebellion or sedition, using force for political goals. But the second one on the right, that's the one we see all the time. That's attacking or seriously intimidating an official who is just trying to do their job.
So for the rest of our time here, let's just focus on that second type. Why? Well, because honestly, that's where all the real-world action is. It's where you find most of the court cases, most of the public arguments, and frankly, the most surprising parts of the law.
Which brings us to maybe the most important question of all. Does any little push or shove automatically count as a direct assault? You might think so, but the answer is, it's not that simple. And the answer really boils down to this. It completely depends on who you assault. So if you're talking about an agent, like a police officer, the law is specific. The force you use has to be serious. The courts have said it needs to show a clear determination to defy the law. A simple little push just might not cut it. And check out this real-life case. In a case called U.S. versus Tabiana, the court actually ruled that hitting a policeman on the chest while he was making an arrest was not direct assault. Why? Because the law is looking for something more than just, and I'm quoting here, a simple blow with the hands. Okay, but here's the massive twist. If the person you lay a hand on is a person in authority, remember that's your barangay captain, your teacher, the rule book gets thrown out the window. In that situation, the law says the force does not have to be serious at all. In this case, just drives the point home perfectly. U.S. versus Gumban. A slap across the face of a municipal president? The court said, yep, that's direct assault. So let's get this straight. Hitting a cop might not be, but slapping a mayor is. It all comes down to the victim's status. That is everything in these cases.
Of course, not everything is a full-blown direct assault. The law actually has lesser offenses too, and it creates this clear hierarchy of crimes.
Yeah, it's really important to think of this whole thing less like a single crime and more like a spectrum. The law looks at exactly what you did, who you did it to, and what you were thinking, and then it places your actions somewhere on that spectrum, from just simple disobedience all the way up to a really serious assault.
And this chart here breaks it down really nicely. So right at the top, you've got direct assault. That's the physical attack we've been talking about. Then you've got this interesting one, indirect assault. This is super specific. It's when you use force on someone who's trying to help an authority figure who's already being assaulted. So Good Samaritan jumps in to help a cop, and you attack the Samaritan. Bam! That's indirect assault. And finally at the bottom, you've got resistance and disobedience. This is all about defying a lawful order. And often there's no force involved at all. It's just the act of refusing to cooperate that becomes the crime.
So after all that, what are the big things you really need to remember? Let's boil it all down to the key takeaways.
Basically, it all comes down to asking these 4 questions. First, who was the victim? A person in authority or an agent? Second, what was the action? Was it a physical attack or were you just resisting? Third, how much force was really used? And finally, and this one is absolutely critical, was that official acting lawfully and just doing their duty? Because if they weren't, well, that changes the entire game.
At the end of the day, these laws aren't just about punishing people. They're really there to protect the idea of authority itself, which our system sees as being totally essential for keeping public order. But, as we've seen pretty clearly, how that plays out depends so much on the little details, the context, the status of the people involved, and what their intentions were. And that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. The law is super clear about what happens when you defy authority. But what about when authority itself acts unlawfully? What happens when the roles are reversed? What can a citizen do then? Well, that's the story for another time.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are going to try and save you from going to prison. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, but after reading through this stack of legal documents you prepared, all these case laws and penal codes, I realized something pretty terrifying.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
I have probably, and I mean almost certainly, come very close to accidentally committing a grave crime against the government just by, having a bad attitude on the wrong day.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to navigate the world assuming that if we aren't, physically hurting anyone, we aren't really breaking the law.
Right.
But when you start dealing with this concept of public order, the rules just completely change.
They really do. We are wading into some very murky waters today. We're talking about crimes against public order, specifically focusing on Articles 148 through 152 of the Revised Penal Code. But we aren't just reading the code. The mission for this deep dive is to really decode the hierarchy of authority, because it turns out the law protects certain people very differently than others. It's not just about assault in the way you or I might think of it.
No, it's not a bar fight.
It's not a bar fight. It's about assaulting the idea of authority, the very concept of it.
That is the crucial distinction. When we talk about direct assault, indirect assault, resistance, disobedience, we aren't talking about personal grievances. We're talking about an attack on the state itself.
The state.
Yes. When you strike a specific type of official, the law doesn't see it as you hitting a guy named Bob. The law sees it as you striking the government. And well, the government takes that very, very personally.
Okay, before we get into the weeds, I want to hit you with the fact that absolutely blew my mind. It's the hook that made me realize I know nothing about how this works.
Go for it.
According to the sources we have here, specifically the way the courts interpret the idea of force, there is this double standard that feels completely backwards. If I walk up to a municipal president, so basically a mayor, and I slap him in the face, just a slap, that is a grave offense, direct assault. We're talking jail time.
Correct. That is a crime against public order, a serious one.
And this is the crazy part. If I get into a scuffle with a police officer, a guy with a gun, a badge, the whole uniform, and I shove him, or maybe I even punch him in the chest, but I don't break any ribs or anything, that might not be considered direct assault.
It sounds wild, doesn't it?
It does.
You would assume the police officer, the person whose physical body is on the line to enforce the law every single day, would have the highest level of protection.
Of course.
But the law draws a very sharp, almost philosophical line between a person in authority and an agent of a person in authority. A slap to the first one is an insult to the state. A shove to the second one might just be, well, resistance.
That is exactly what we need to unpack because it feels, I don't know, it feels classist, it feels archaic, and it's incredibly specific. And get this, teachers.
Ah, yes, the teachers.
If you're listening and you're a teacher, you need to know this. You are considered a person in authority. So, legally speaking, a student slapping a professor is in the same ballpark as a citizen slapping the mayor.
Under Article 152, yes, absolutely. And here's the really scary part for everyone else. Ignorance of that fact is no excuse.
What do you mean?
You can't tell the judge, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know she counted as a person in authority. The law just assumes you know the hierarchy. It's on you.
Which is why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
To map out that exact hierarchy, we have a lot of case law to get through real decisions from the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals that take these dry rules and apply them to actual messy human situations.
We've got stories about angry police forces taking hostages, teachers getting into fights on the road.
And even a brawl on a dance floor?
Yes, case law is where the theory really hits the pavement. It's one thing to read a statute, it's another thing entirely to see how a judge rules when a barrio captain gets punched at a fiesta.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation, the cast of characters. Before we can even understand the crime, we have to know who the potential victims are, who actually counts as a person in authority. Because looking at Article 152, it's not just the people we vote for.
No, it's much, much broader. The fundamental definition in Article 152 is anyone who is directly vested with jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction. So that means they have the power to govern and execute laws.
Precisely.
So that's your governor, your mayor, your barangay captain, the people with the title on the door, the obvious ones.
Exactly. Those are the easy ones. But then the statute goes on to list some very specific roles that the law has decided to elevate to this status. And some of them are quite surprising.
Like what?
For example, division superintendents of schools.
Okay, high-level school administrators. Makes some sense.
And here's a title that really gives you a sense of how old this code is. Presidents of sanitary divisions.
Presidents of sanitary divisions. What is that? The guy in charge of the sewers.
Essentially, yes. It refers to health officials with jurisdiction. I mean, you have to think back to the early 20th century. Sanitation was a massive part of governance and public order.
Right, cholera, typhoid.
Exactly. So the president of the sanitary division was a powerful figure. If you slapped him, you were, in a way, slapping the hand that kept the cholera away from your village.
I love that. Respect the plumber, or else.
But okay, the one that affects the most people on a daily basis has to be paragraph 3 of Article 152. Teachers.
Teachers, professors, and persons charged with the supervision of public or duly recognized private schools. This is a massive category of people.
And that includes private schools. It's not just public school teachers.
As long as the school is duly recognized by the government, yes. The law explicitly elevates them to persons in authority. This has been affirmed in multiple cases.
But why, why does a physics professor get the same legal shield as a governor? What's the logic?
Well, part of it stems from the old concept of in loco parentis, the idea that the teacher stands in the place of a parent.
But it's more than that. The state has a vested interest in the education of its youth. If you can't protect the teacher, you can't maintain order and sanctity in the classroom. If the classroom falls into chaos, the future of the state is seen as compromised. So the law wraps the teacher in this protective cloak of authority.
So if I'm a parent and I march into a classroom and start shoving a teacher because I'm mad about my kid's grade, I'm not just committing simple assault, I'm committing a crime against public order.
You are. And the penalties are significantly steeper.
Wow. Who else is on this VIP list?
Lawyers. But there's a pretty big catch.
There's always a catch with lawyers.
A lawyer is considered a person in authority only while they are in the actual performance of their professional duties or on the occasion of that performance.
So context matters a lot. If I run into my lawyer at the grocery store and we get into an argument over the last bag of coffee beans, he's just a regular guy.
Exactly. He's just another civilian. But if you attack him in the courtroom, during a hearing, or if you wait for him in the parking lot because you're angry about how he cross-examined you, then he is a person in authority.
That distinction is going to keep coming up, isn't it? The why you did it matters just as much as the who you did it to.
It absolutely does. And speaking of who, we can't forget the barangay officials. Barangay captains and chairmen are explicitly named as persons in authority.
That makes sense. They're the heads of the smallest political unit. They're the most accessible form of government a person interacts with day to day.
Right. And I want to circle back to that ignorance is no excuse rule you mentioned. There's a case, People versus Balber.
Okay.
And it establishes that the status of a person in authority is a matter of law. You can't use the defense of, you can't say, Your Honor, I just thought he was some guy. I had no idea he was a teacher.
So if you're going to get into a fight, you better check their LinkedIn profile first.
Effectively, yes. The law places the burden on the citizen to respect the office, even if the citizen is unaware of the office holder's specific credentials in that moment.
That is a very high bar. Okay, so that's the VIP list, the persons in authority. But then we have the agents, and this is where the confusion and that double standard starts to creep in. What is the difference between a person in authority and an agent of a person in authority?
Think of it as the difference between the brain and the hand, or the decision maker and the enforcer.
Okay, I like that.
A person in authority holds the jurisdiction, they decide. An agent is a person who, by direct provision of law or by appointment, is charged with the maintenance of public order and the protection and security of life and property.
So the police, that's the first group that comes to mind.
Primarily, yes. Policemen are the classic agents.
Yeah.
They enforce the will of the persons in authority. But the list is definitely wider than just cops.
I saw municipal treasurer on the list in the notes. That seems really odd.
It does, doesn't it? But in the case People versus Ramos, the court held that the municipal treasurer is an ex officio deputy of the provincial treasurer.
Okay.
Since the provincial treasurer is a person in authority, the municipal treasurer becomes his agent.
It's like a contagion of authority. If you work for the VIP, you become an agent.
In some cases, yes. The postmaster is another one. That was from People versus Estier.
That postmaster.
They're protecting the communication of the state. That's considered a public order issue. Then you have rural policemen, but only if they are duly appointed and provided with a badge.
The badge makes the man.
In that case, literally, according to the court, if you don't have the badge and the formal appointment, you're just a guy with a stick. With a badge, you're an agent of the law.
Sheriffs, BIR agents, Malacanang confidential agents, they all make the list. But there is one entry here that absolutely terrified me. It's what you called the Good Samaritan Clause. And I want to really paint a picture here because this could happen to any of us.
This comes from the last paragraph of Article 152. It's a fascinating, and you're right, slightly terrifying provision.
So picture this. I'm walking down the street, minding my own business. I see a scuffle. It's the mayor. He's getting pushed around by some angry constituent. Being a good citizen, I step in, I say, hey, break it up, and I try to pull the attacker off of him.
Okay.
In that exact second, what happens to my legal status?
In that split second, you undergo a metamorphosis. You're no longer just a civilian. By coming to the aid of a person in authority, you automatically become an agent of a person in authority.
I'm deputized. Instantly.
Automatically. You don't need a badge. You don't need an oath. The act of aiding the authority confers the status of agent upon you.
So if the attacker turns around and punches me in the face...
They aren't punching a bystander. They are assaulting an agent of the law. The charges against them escalate immediately from simple physical injuries to something much more severe.
That is wild. It's like a power-up in a video game.
Yeah.
But it's also really dangerous, right? Because now I'm deeply involved in a crime against public order.
It is dangerous, but the law does it to encourage citizens to help. It's the state saying, if you help us maintain order, we will extend our official protection to you.
Okay, so we have our cast, the VIPs, who are the persons in authority, and the enforcers, the agents, and sometimes regular people like me. Now, let's get to the crime itself. Article 148, direct assault. And you said this is split into two modes.
That's right. Two distinct ways to commit the same crime.
And mode one is, well, it's intense. It's not just a fight. It feels deeply political.
Mode one is very political. It's often described as a form of sedition that didn't quite make the cut.
Sedition light.
Exactly. Mode one is defined as employing force or intimidation to attain any of the purposes of rebellion or sedition, but, and this is the key, without a public uprising.
Okay, so for those of us listening, sedition usually means a massive crowd, chaos, trying to overthrow the government. Mode one is when you try to do that, but you only have like 5 guys with you.
Basically, if you have the intent of sedition like removing an official from office or preventing an election, but you lack the massive public uprising, it falls under direct assault mode 1.
We have to talk about the case of U.S. versus Durain. This is the angry police force story, and I want you to take us there, because when I read the summary, it sounded like a movie script.
It really does.
Okay.
So set the scene. It's the early 1900s, a small municipality. It's hot, it's dusty, and the entire local police force is furious.
Why? What happened?
They haven't been paid. Their salaries are in arrears for months, they have families to feed, debts to pay, and the municipal government just isn't paying them. The tension is boiling over.
A broke cop is a dangerous cop.
Extremely. So one day, they snap. The police force, armed, goes to the municipal president, the mayor. And they don't just file a complaint. They force him, essentially at gunpoint, to go to the municipal building. They lock him in his office. They detain him for 4 hours.
They kidnapped the mayor.
To a layperson, that's what it looks like. Kidnapping. Illegal detention. But when this went to court, they had to analyze the motive. The defense might have argued, we just wanted our money. This was a labor dispute.
We were just negotiating.
With guns. But the court looked deeper. They said the police were inflicting hate and vengeance upon a public officer. They were attacking him because he was the authority who wasn't paying them.
And inflicting hate and vengeance on an official is a seditious object.
Exactly. Attempting to strip the mayor of his freedom and his authority, even for just 4 hours, is an act with a seditious purpose. But because the whole town didn't rise up with pitchforks, it was just this disgruntled police squad, it wasn't sedition with a capital S.
It was direct assault mode 1.
Precisely.
That is such a fine line. If the town baker and the blacksmith had joined them, it might have been actual sedition.
Very likely, yes. The lack of a public uprising is the only thing that kept it in Article 148.
There's another case here, Claren versus Justice of the Peace. This one is about stopping an election.
Right. Another classic example. Imagine a group of thugs blocking the entrance to a polling place. They aren't trying to overthrow the entire national government, but they are using force to prevent the holding of a popular election in their town.
Which is a goal of sedition.
Preventing a free election is absolutely a seditious goal. But again, if it's just a local gang and not a national movement, it's direct assault mode 1.
Now, here's a weird loophole in mode 1. In these specific political cases, the victim doesn't actually have to be a person in authority.
That's the theoretical quirk of this mode, because the crime is defined by the intent, the seditious goal. The status of the person you attack is secondary. If you use force against a private citizen who's just trying to vote, but your goal is to stop the election, it's still direct assault mode 1.
Wow. Okay, so that's mode 1. Rare, political, very heavy. Now let's talk about the one that actually happens in bars and on streets. Mode 2. This is the bread and butter of assault on an officer.
This is what we see in 99% of cases. The elements are, first, the offender makes an attack, employs force, makes serious intimidation, or makes serious resistance.
Okay.
Second, the person assaulted is a person in authority or their agent. And third, and this is crucial, the victim must be engaged in the performance of official duties or are assaulted because of past performance of those duties.
Okay, I want to park on that force aspect because this is where I got angry on behalf of police officers everywhere. The notes say there is a massive difference in how the law defines force depending on who you're hitting.
There is. And to understand it, we have to go back to the philosophy of the symbol.
Walk me through it. Let's start with the agent, the cop on the beat.
If you are dealing with an agent like a police officer, the courts have ruled over and over that the force employed against them must be of a serious character.
Serious character? That sounds really subjective.
It is, but the bar is set very high. It has to indicate a determination to defy the law and its representative at all hazards.
At all hazards. Okay, so a little push, slap on the wrist.
Not enough. Not even close. Let's look at the case of U.S. versus Tabiana. I want you to picture this. A policeman is making an arrest. The suspect is resisting. In the struggle, the suspect hits the policeman in the breast, right in the chest, with his hand.
He punches a cop in the chest.
Yes, but the court ruled this was not direct assault.
Hold on, how is punching a cop in the chest not assault?
The court said that the employment of force must involve something more dangerous to society than a simple blow with the hands. They saw it as simple resistance or maybe slight physical injuries, but it didn't rise to the level of direct assault because it didn't show that at all hazards defiance.
That seems incredibly unfair to the officer. He's doing his job, he gets punched, and the court says, not serious enough. So where's the line? When does it become direct assault?
The line is drawn clearly in U.S. versus Cox. Now, compare this to the chest punch. In Cox, the offender first challenged the policeman to a fight.
Okay, so there's premeditation.
Then, without waiting for a reply, he seized the cop by the throat, threw him to the ground, wrestled the club away from him, and then beat the officer with his own weapon.
Okay, yeah, that is a different universe.
That is at all hazards. Choking, disarming, and using a weapon against the officer.
Yeah.
That shows a clear, unambiguous intent to destroy the authority of that agent. That is direct assault.
So for an agent, you really have to go all out. You have to try to take them down. Now, let's switch to the person in authority. The mayor, the teacher, the judge. Does that serious force rule apply to them?
No. And this is the double standard we talked about at the top. If the offended party is a person in authority, the force employed does not need to be serious.
It can be minor.
It can be very minor. U.S. versus Gumben. This is the classic case. The offender simply slapped the face of the municipal president while he was performing his duties.
Just a slap. No choking, no wrestling for a club.
Just a slap. A single slap. The court held this as direct assault. It is laying hands upon a person in authority.
But why? Why is the mayor's cheek more sacred in the eyes of the law than the cop's chest?
Because the person in authority is the symbol. They hold the jurisdiction. They are the mind of the state. The agent is just the muscle.
The mind and the muscle.
Exactly. The law assumes that the muscle can take a punch. That's part of the job description.
Yeah.
But the mind must be inviolate. To slap a mayor is to slap the dignity of the office itself. It's a symbolic attack on the state, not just a physical one on a person.
So it's about the fragility of the ego of the state.
You could say that. Or the sanctity of the institution.
Yeah.
But the thinking is, if you can slap a mayor with impunity, the government loses its perceived legitimacy. If you punch a cop, well, that's just an occupational hazard for law enforcement.
That is a fascinating, if maybe a little cynical way to look at it. The mind is too important to be touched. The muscle is expendable.
That is the hierarchy of the penal code.
Okay, let's move to the on-duty requirement. Because this isn't some magical force field that protects these people 24/7, right? If the mayor is on vacation in Hawaii, can I slap him then? And it's just a regular slap.
Generally, yes. The crime requires the victim to be engaged in the performance of official duties. But official duties can be interpreted in very interesting ways, especially for our teachers.
Right, let's look at the teacher cases, because teachers don't just stay in the classroom from 9 to 5.
Exactly. Let's look at People versus Ballet. In this case, a school teacher was traveling. He wasn't in school. He was on the road.
So he's just commuting.
But he was on his way to deliver school reports and school properties to a superior. Complying with an official directive, he was carrying the paperwork.
He is on a mission for the school.
Precisely. And he gets attacked. The court ruled direct assault. Why? Because the duties of a teacher are not limited to the four walls of the classroom. He was in the act of performing an official duty, transporting those reports.
Okay, that makes sense. He was on the clock, just not in the usual location. But what about when they really step off the clock?
People versus Jinko.
Yeah.
Here, a teacher physically steps out of his classroom to talk to a creditor about some unpaid accounts.
Hey, you owe me money.
Exactly. A purely private dispute. He gets attacked during this conversation, the court says. Not direct assault. He had stepped outside his official capacity to handle a personal, private matter.
So the protection is like a light switch. It turns off the moment you stop being teacher and start being debtor.
Precisely. The protection applies to the function, not the human being.
But then we have the dance floor case, People versus Gellet. And this is my favorite one because it paints such a vivid picture of barrio life.
It really does.
Yeah.
So imagine a public dance. It's a fiesta. There's music, food, maybe a little too much tuba, the local coconut wine.
Right.
The barrio captain is there. He's not in his office. He's just enjoying the party with everyone else.
He's off the clock.
Theoretically. But some ladies at the dance complain to him that a certain man is behaving, let's say, in an ungentlemanly manner.
He's being rude on the dance floor, maybe getting a little too close, a little too grabby.
Something like that. So the barrio captain steps in. He reprimands the man. Hey, show some respect. The man gets angry and attacks the captain.
Now, the defense would obviously argue he was at a party, he wasn't governing, this was personal.
And that's what they tried. But the court said, wrong. A barrio captain is charged with maintaining peace and order in his community. That duty follows him. By reprimanding the rude guest to keep the peace, he activated his duty.
Oh, wow.
He was performing the function of keeping the peace, therefore attacking him was direct assault.
So for some officials like captains and police, they're like sleeper agents. Their authority is always dormant and just waiting to be activated by trouble.
If they intervene to maintain public order, yes, they are never truly off duty in the eyes of the law.
That is a heavy burden to carry. You can never just be a guy at a party. Now, there is one major exception to this whole on-duty rule, the past performance trigger.
This is the scary one, because you can be charged with direct assault even if the victim is totally off duty, sleeping in their bed, walking home, on vacation, provided that the motive for the attack is revenge for past official acts.
This is the grudge clause.
U.S. versus Garcia illustrates this perfectly. A justice of the peace was walking home. He was done for the day. He's walking down the street, probably thinking about dinner. He gets attacked, struck with a cane and slapped.
That's brutal.
The defense argued he wasn't working. This is just simple physical injuries. But the evidence showed the attack was precipitated by a verbal exchange about a decision the justice had rendered in a civil suit.
You ruled against me in court last week, so now I'm going to beat you up on the street.
Exactly that. The court said it doesn't matter that he was walking home. The reason for the attack was his official performance. Therefore, it is direct assault. The law protects the official from retribution for their decisions.
So you can't wait for the judge to clock out. The protection follows him home if your motive is about his work.
Correct. The motive connects the private attack back in the public office.
Okay, let's move to Section 4. What disqualifies direct assault? How do you get out of this charge? We talked about private disputes, but there's a really big one. Abuse of authority.
This is the illegal orders defense, and it's absolutely vital for civil liberties. For direct assault to exist, the official must be acting within the scope of their authority. If they go beyond it, they lose the protection.
Tell me about the fishing net case, People versus Telos.
This is a great example of an official overstepping his bounds. A chief of police tried to seize a fishing net from the accused.
Just walked up and took it.
He tried to, but he didn't have a warrant. He didn't have a court order. He was just acting on his own initiative, thinking his badge gave him the power.
But is he allowed to do that?
The court said no. He wasn't clothed with the judicial power to just seize private property like that. So when the fisherman resisted, when he fought back to keep his net, it was not direct assault.
Because the chief wasn't acting as a chief of police. He was acting as a thief.
Effectively, yes. He was acting without authority. If the act of the official is illegal, resisting it is not an assault on authority, because true authority must act within the law. The badge is not a license to do whatever you want.
That is a powerful concept. The shield of the law just evaporates the moment you break the law yourself.
Exactly. And another case, People versus Dumo, adds to this. If the agent uses unnecessary violence first, the citizen has a right to defend themselves. Self-defense is valid against an officer who attacks you unlawfully.
Good to know. If a cop starts beating you for no reason, you are legally allowed to block the punches.
You are. Though proving that in court later is, of course, another matter entirely.
A very fair point. Now let's shift gears to Section 5. Indirect assault. Article 149. We mentioned the Good Samaritan earlier, that if you help a cop, you become an agent. But indirect assault is specifically about attacking that helper, right?
Yes, but it is very, very nuanced. This is often called the third-party problem in law schools.
So lay out the scenario for me.
Okay. First, a person in authority or an agent must be being assaulted. Direct assault has to be happening. That is the trigger.
Okay, so the main crime is already in progress.
Correct. Second, a third person comes to the aid of that authority. Third, the offender then attacks this helper.
So I see a cop getting beaten up by a suspect. Direct assault is happening. I run in to pull the attacker off. The attacker then turns and punches me. That is indirect assault.
Yes, because you are aiding the authority who is the victim of a direct assault.
But wait, the notes have a crucial distinction here that broke my brain a little. What if the cop isn't being beaten up? What if the cop is just struggling to arrest someone who's resisting?
This is the catch that trips up so many people. If a private individual is helping a policeman make a lawful arrest, say, holding a guy down who's just squirming and trying to get away, and the suspect kicks the helper, that is not indirect assault.
Why not? He's helping the cop. He's an agent.
He is an agent, but the policeman wasn't being assaulted in the serious legal sense of Article 148. He was just performing his duty, making an arrest, and the suspect was merely resisting. Remember, simple resistance isn't direct assault.
Oh, wow. So if the cop is just wrestling and I help and I get hit, I'm on my own, legally speaking.
Well, you might get him for physical injuries, but not the crime of indirect assault. Indirect assault only happens when the original authority figure is the victim of a proper direct assault first.
That is hair-splitting to an extreme degree. I feel like we need a flowchart for this. Imagine the scene. I see a fight. I run up. "Excuse me, officer. Are you currently being direct assaulted or just resisted? I need to know before I tag in."
Just check Article 148 quickly before you help me. No, in reality, you just help. But the lawyers get to argue about these very fine definitions later.
It just shows how complex the fog of war is in these situations. Okay, let's move to Section 6, Disobedience to the Legislature, Article 150. This feels really different from the street fights we've been talking about. This is white-collar defiance.
It is. This moves us from the street to the hearing room. Article 150 punishes refusing to obey a summons from Congress, refusing to be sworn in, or refusing to answer legal inquiries.
We see this on the news all the time. A Senate hearing is called. Some wealthy CEO refuses to show up, or they show up and just plead the fifth to every question.
And that tension is exactly what Article 150 navigates. The legislature has the power to summon you. If you just ignore it, that's a crime. However, there is a massive constitutional defense here.
The right against self-incrimination.
Correct. The case of O.E. Caton versus Villarreal is key. The court ruled that while the legislature has investigative power, they cannot force you to produce documents that would act as evidence against yourself in a criminal case.
They can't make you build the gallows they're planning to hang you on.
No. And also, another case, Arnaud versus Nazareno, clarifies that these investigations must be in aid of legislation.
In aid of legislation, we hear that phrase a lot. What does it actually mean in practice?
It means Congress isn't a court. Their job isn't to fish for crimes just to prosecute people. That's the job of the Department of Justice and the judiciary. They should be gathering facts in order to make better laws.
I see.
If the questioning strays from that purpose into a purely criminal investigation, the witness has grounds to push back.
So Article 150 has teeth, but the Constitution acts as a necessary muzzle.
A very necessary check and balance. Otherwise, the legislature could just become a super court.
All right, Section 7, the catch-all bucket, resistance and disobedience. Article 151, this is for when the act doesn't quite meet that high force and intimidation bar of direct assault.
Right. If you aren't beating the cop at all hazards, you are probably landing here. Article 151 covers serious disobedience and simple disobedience.
Let's start with serious disobedience. What are the elements?
This requires a direct order addressed specifically to the offender. And the offender has to know the person giving the order is an authority.
This is where that mistake of fact case comes in. U.S. versus Bautista.
Yes. And this is a terrifying scenario. Imagine you are walking home late at night in a dangerous part of town. Suddenly, some armed men in plain clothes surround you and start shouting orders. Get down! Stop! Yeah. They don't identify themselves. It's dark.
I'm thinking they are bandits. I'm thinking I'm about to get robbed or killed.
Exactly. So you run or you fight back.
Which is a perfectly reasonable reaction.
Turns out they were police conducting an operation. But the court said, no crime. A mistake of fact applies. If you honestly and reasonably didn't know they were authorities, you couldn't have intended to disobey the authority. You were just trying to survive.
Context is everything. Now, what about simple disobedience? The notes have a somewhat funny case here. People versus Macapuno.
The passive resistance case. A man lies down in the middle of the road. An army officer orders him to get up.
Get up, sir. You're blocking the road.
A man refuses. He just stays there. He doesn't fight. He doesn't scream or curse. He just goes limp.
Like a toddler in a supermarket aisle.
Essentially, yes. But legally, is it disobedience? The court said yes. It's simple disobedience. He isn't fighting, but he is failing to comply with a lawful order from an agent of authority.
And then we have the biting case. People versus Veloso. And honestly, this one shocked me more than any other.
This is the one that makes you scratch your head. An accused person, in the middle of an arrest, bites a policeman's forearm and hits him.
He bit the cop.
And severely injured him.
And that wasn't direct assault. We just talked about how force against an agent needs to be serious. Biting seems pretty serious to me.
You would think so. But the court found it to be resistance under Article 151, not direct assault under Article 148.
How on earth did they justify that?
They looked at the intent. They said the force wasn't deliberate or intended to defy the law as an institution. It happened in the heat of the moment, in a chaotic scramble. It wasn't a calculated attack on the authority. It was a desperate, almost animalistic reaction to being arrested.
So biting a cop in a panic is legally better than calmly slapping a mayor?
Based on these specific cases, yes. That deliberate intent to defy is the magic ingredient for the graver crimes. If you are just flailing and biting because you are scared or angry, it's resistance. If you calmly grab the club and choke him, that's assault.
That is mind-blowing. The law is literally trying to read your mind while you are biting someone.
That is the job of the court, to find the mens requirement, the criminal mind.
And finally, justified resistance. We talked about the illegal fishing net seizure, but there are other times you can legally say no to a cop.
Absolutely. People versus Chan Fook. Resistance to an illegal search. If they don't have a warrant and they don't have probable cause, you can resist. People versus Dawes covers unlawful arrest. You are not required to submit to an arrest that has no legal basis.
And U.S. versus Penelligan?
That case involved police meddling in purely private business affairs. The court basically said, if the police are poking their noses where the law doesn't fund them, a citizen has the right to tell them to back off.
That brings us right back to the central theme of this whole deep dive, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Let's try to synthesize this. We've gone from the sanctity of a teacher's authority all the way to the right, to resist an illegal fishing net seizure. We've seen that a slap can be worse than a punch, depending entirely on who you hit.
The consistent theme is the symbol. The law, in Articles 148 to 152, is obsessed with protecting the symbol of order. It protects the office more than the man or woman holding it.
The mind over the muscle.
Exactly. That is why the person in authority, the mayor, the judge, the teacher, gets that extra layer of sacredness over the agent, the cop. The cop is the muscle. The authority is the mind of the state. To attack the mind is sedition adjacent. To attack the muscle is just resistance.
That explains the whole disparity. It's a philosophical hierarchy that's been encoded into our penal law for over a century.
It is. But it also balances that incredible power with the scope of duty. The protection only exists when the symbol is functioning as a symbol. If the mayor acts as a private bully or the cop acts as a thief, the shield vanishes.
Which is a very comforting thought at the end of the day. The uniform isn't a free pass.
It is a conditional privilege.
Yeah.
And it can be revoked by their own illegal actions.
So here is where we usually leave our listeners with a final thought to chew on. After all this, what does it all mean for us?
You know, we talked about how knowledge of the status is essential. You have to know it's a cop to be guilty of disobeying a cop. But then we have the contradictory rule that ignorance of the law is no excuse when it comes to who counts as an authority.
Right. You're just supposed to know that a teacher is a person in authority.
Here's the provocation. The law assumes a level of clarity that almost never exists in a real-life chaotic situation. We talked about the Good Samaritan. If you step in to help a cop, you become an agent. But in a chaotic brawl, on a dark street, people screaming, maybe plainclothes officers are involved, how does a regular citizen distinguish between a private brawl and a crime against the state?
That's a great point. You see two guys fighting. One is yelling that he's a cop. The other is yelling self-defense. If you jump in to help the person who claims to be a cop, you might be an agent of authority, or you might be committing direct assault on an innocent person being abused by a corrupt officer.
And how do you make that call in a split second? The law demands we respect the hierarchy, but the reality of the street often hides that hierarchy in the fog of war. We are expected to recognize authority instantly, even when authority is behaving badly or isn't clearly identifiable. It's a very high standard for the average citizen to meet.
A high standard indeed. So next time you see a commotion, maybe check for badges, check for official sashes, and maybe check if anyone is holding a grade book.
And perhaps just keep your hands to yourself.
Always good advice. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.
Welcome to The Debate.
It's good to be here.
Today, we're going to dissect a very specific and I think a very volatile moment in civil society. It's that friction point where a private citizen collides with the power of the state. We're talking about the traffic stop that goes sideways, the heated argument with a public official, or, the chaotic moments of an arrest.
And while that sounds like something for YouTube body cam footage, what we're actually looking at is the legal architecture beneath those moments. We're analyzing Articles 148 through 152 of the Revised Penal Code. These are the statutes that define direct assault, indirect assault, and a resistance to persons in authority.
Right. So the central question we need to answer today is really one of boundaries. Where does the law draw the line? At what point does a citizen's frustration, maybe a raised voice, or a refusal to move, transform into a criminal attack on the government itself? When does bad behavior become a felony?
It's a terrifying line, mostly because it's invisible until you've already crossed it. I'm approaching this conversation from the perspective that the law requires, or at least it should require, a very high threshold of seriousness and a very specific intent before we throw someone in prison for being emotional. I mean, human beings are fallible. High-stress encounters are messy. We can't just equate a moment of confusion or panic with insurrection.
I understand the sympathy for the human element, but I'm taking the stance that strict enforcement here is non-negotiable. The person in authority and the agent are not just people with jobs. They are the physical avatars of the state. My argument is that any physical challenge to them, regardless of how minor it seems, undermines the very function of governments. You can't have a rule of law if the enforcers of that law are open targets for physical disrespect.
But open targets is strong language. I'm not saying people should be allowed to punch police officers. I'm saying that the definition of assault needs to be realistic about human nature.
Well, let's look at the reality then. Let's start with Article 148, direct assault. We aren't talking about the first mode of this crime, the one that involves rebellion or sedition. We're focused on the second mode, attacking, employing force, or seriously intimidating persons in authority or their agents while they're performing their duties.
Right, and this brings us immediately to what I think is the most controversial distinction in this entire legal framework. The difference between a person in authority, let's just call them a PIA, and an agent of a person in authority.
It is a vital distinction, not just a semantic one.
It feels a bit like a caste system to me.
It's structural. Under Article 152, a person in authority is someone directly vested with jurisdiction. They have the power to govern and execute laws. So we're talking about municipal presidents, division superintendents of schools, teachers, professors, and even lawyers when they're performing their duties. These people hold the decision-making power of society.
And this is where the legal summary starts to get wild. Because of who these people are, the law drastically lowers the bar for what counts as assault against them.
Correct. This is established in the landmark case of U.S. versus Gumben. And I want to paint the picture for the listeners. In this case, you had a municipal president, a person in authority, performing his official duties. Gumban, the accused, walked up and slapped him.
A slap.
Just a slap. Was the president hospitalized? No. Was he permanently injured? No. But the Supreme Court ruled this was direct assault.
And that is the person in authority standard.
Exactly. When the victim is a person in authority, the force employed need not be serious. The court reasoned that the slap wasn't just about the physical pain on the cheek. It was a defiant laying of hands on the office itself. When you slap a municipal president, you are in effect slapping the state. The injury isn't to the flesh, it's to the dignity of the government.
But see, that is where I get worried. If I slap a municipal president, it's a felony. But if I get into a shoving match with a police officer, someone who actually faces physical danger for a living, the standard changes completely.
Because the police officer is an agent, not the authority itself.
Exactly. And for an agent, the law says the force must be of a serious character to constitute direct assault. Let's look at U.S. versus Tabiana. This is a crucial case for my argument. The accused hit a policeman in the breast during an arrest. He was resisting. He physically struck the officer.
He did, yes.
But the court said, no, that's not direct assault. And why? Because the force wasn't serious enough. The court said the strike didn't show a determination to defy the law at all hazards. It was categorized as a scuffle, a resistance. So help me understand this hierarchy. If I push a policeman and land a few blows that don't injure him, like we saw in People versus Reyes, I might get off with resistance or simple disobedience. But if a parent loses their temper and slaps a teacher, who is a person in authority per People versus Benitez, that's automatically the gray felony of direct assault?
Yes, and for a very functional reason. The policeman is trained, equipped, and legally expected to handle physical confrontation. It's part of the job description. Physical engagement is the nature of law enforcement. But a teacher, a division superintendent, a lawyer in court, they are the civil intellect of the state. They aren't combatants.
So they get a force field?
Essentially, yes. If you allow citizens to physically humiliate a teacher or a judge with a mere slap, you're signaling that the government's decision-making apparatus is weak. The rigidity of the Gumben ruling protects the dignity of the office. The agent is protected too, of course, But because they are in the physical fray, the bar for assault is higher to distinguish between, say, a struggle to escape and a deliberate attack on the law.
It still implies that the dignity of a superintendent is worth more than the safety of a rural policeman. In People versus Dawsall, we see these rural policemen, appointed by mayors, out there trying to keep the peace in remote areas. If someone pushes them, they should have the full weight of direct assault behind them. They shouldn't have to argue in court about whether the push was serious enough to count.
But the law does protect them, just under Article 151, resistance and disobedience, which we can get to. It's not that the act goes unpunished, it's just categorized differently based on the severity of the threat to the state structure. But before we get to resistance, we have to talk about the when, because you can't just claim these protections 24/7.
Right. This is the scope of duty question. And honestly, this is the only thing keeping these statutes from being total tyranny. For Article 148 to apply, the official must be engaged in the performance of official duties, or the attack must be on occasion of such performance.
It's a critical boundary. The badge doesn't grant you super rights when you're buying groceries, generally speaking.
And the courts are surprisingly technical about it. Look at U.S. versus Marasigan. You had a Beria lieutenant, definitely a person in authority. He gets shot in the head.
Which is obviously serious force.
Extremely. But the court said it wasn't direct assault. Why? Because at the moment he was shot, he was intervening in a case that was already under the jurisdiction of the justice of the peace. He had stepped out of his lane. He wasn't acting on duty because he had no legal authority to act in that specific moment. He was just a private citizen butting in.
That just shows the law is precise. It doesn't blindly back the badge. If you aren't acting within your jurisdiction, you aren't the state.
Or take People versus Jinko. A teacher is a person in authority, right? While this teacher went to a debtor's house to collect money for some private school accounts, a fight broke out. The court said, no direct assault. He wasn't a teacher in that moment, he was a debt collector.
I accept those limitations. However, you're glossing over the on occasion clause, which is a powerful expansion of this protection. It effectively means by reason of. The law understands that an official's safety can be compromised even when they're off the clock, strictly because of the job they do.
You're thinking of retaliation cases.
Precisely. Look at People versus Hecto. You have a Barenga captain, he wasn't holding a meeting, he wasn't settling a dispute, he was just existing in his private time. But he was attacked and killed. The court looked at the motive and found the attack was driven by enmity caused by his past performance of official duties.
And that changed the charge.
Drastically. It became the complex crime of murder with assault. And for the listeners, complex crime is a legal concept where a single act constitutes two or more grave felonies. The penalty is the maximum period of the most serious crime. It's a severe enhancement. The state is saying you cannot attack our representatives for doing their job, even if you wait until they are at home to do it.
That seems fair, provided the motive is clear. But there is a trap door here for the official, specifically in People versus Corrado. If the person in authority provokes the attack, all bets are off.
Well, all bets are off is a bit colloquial, but yes, the principle is sound.
If a judge or a governor steps down from their pedestal and starts a bar fight, insulting someone, provoking them, they step out of that protective shield. They enter the fray as a common citizen. You can't use your office as a shield while you use your fists or your words as a sword.
Agreed. The dignity of the office requires the office holder to act with dignity. But let's shift gears to where the rubber actually meets the road for most people. We've talked about slaps and shootings, but what about just saying no? What about refusal? This is Article 151, resistance and disobedience.
This is the gray zone. This is where I think the law is most dangerous to the average person, because disobedience is subjective.
I disagree. I think it's where the law is most necessary to maintain order. Article 151 penalizes resistance and serious disobedience. My argument is that you don't need to punch a cop to break the state. Serious disobedience undermines order just as effectively as violence.
Okay, give me an example of disobedience that equals a gray felony.
People versus Diama. In that case, the accused pointed a gun at a military police captain on duty. He didn't fire, he just pointed it.
The court ruled that was serious intimidation constituting assault. It wasn't just resistance. The threat of immediate harm froze the law in its tracks.
Okay, pointing a gun is an easy concession. That's an implied threat of death. But disobedience has a prerequisite that law enforcement often forgets. The order itself must be lawful.
Of course, illegal orders are void.
But in the heat of the moment, a citizen asserting that right looks a lot like a criminal resisting arrest. I love the case of People versus Chan Fook.
I had a feeling you would bring that one up.
It's a classic for a reason. The accused resisted a search. He physically pushed back. But the court found that the search warrant was invalid. It was illegal. Therefore, repelling the search was justified. The court effectively said a citizen has the right to say no to an unlawful act. Disobedience to an illegal order isn't a felony, it's a right.
That is true in theory, but think about how dangerous that is in practice. You're asking the citizen to make a snap legal judgment on the validity of a warrant while a cop is shouting at them. If they guess wrong, they go to jail.
Better that than going to jail for blindly obeying tyranny. But let's look at People versus Macapuno. This is about the seriousness of the disobedience. The accused literally lay down on the road to stop a PC major from passing.
Which blocked the road. It obstructed the state's movement.
Yes, but the court ruled it was simple disobedience, not serious resistance. Why? Because the resistance was passive. He didn't strike out, he didn't threaten, he just became an obstacle. That distinction matters. Passivity saves it from being a grave felony.
That's an incredibly charitable reading of passive. I prefer the standard set in U.S. versus Cox.
Cox was violent, though.
Cox shows how quickly resistance becomes assault. The accused challenged a policeman to a fight. He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed the officer by the throat, threw him to the ground, and struck him with the officer's own club.
Okay, stealing the cop's club and hitting him with it, that is clearly direct assault. I don't defend that.
But the defense tried to argue it was just a scuffle. The point is, when you turn the state's weapons against its agents, you aren't resisting anymore. You are attacking. The line is crossed when the physical integrity of the officer is compromised.
But there is a middle ground. People versus Veloso. The accused bit a policeman on the forearm.
Biting seems fairly deliberate to me. That's primal.
You'd think so. But the court found that the bite happened in a messy, chaotic, tumbling arrest. They ruled the force was not deliberate. It wasn't an intent to defy, it was a desperate struggle to escape. Conviction. Resistance, not direct assault. The intent is the magic key. Without the specific intent to defy the authority as an authority, it's just a street fight.
That sounds like splitting hairs to let someone off the hook. But speaking of legal oddities, we have to talk about the Good Samaritan paradox. This is Article 149, indirect assault.
Oh, this is my favorite example of how a technicality can ruin a good deed.
It's not a technicality, it's a specific definition. Indirect assault occurs when someone uses force or intimidation upon a person coming to the aid of a person in authority or their agent.
Okay, so let's paint a scenario. I'm walking down the street. I see a policeman struggling to handcuff a suspect. The cop shouts, "Help me." I run over to help hold the guy's arm. The suspect turns and punches me in the face.
A clear crime.
But is it indirect assault? The law says indirect assault can only be committed when direct assault is also being committed.
Correct.
So if the policeman was just struggling with a resisting suspect pulling away, like in Tabiana, which we've established was not direct assault, then there's no direct assault happening to the cop. Therefore, when the suspect punches me, the helper, I cannot be the victim of indirect assault.
You would likely just be the victim of less serious physical injuries.
Exactly. I stepped in to help the state, and because the cop wasn't being assaulted hard enough, my attacker gets a lighter charge? That's absurd.
It follows the strict logic of the hierarchy. If the primary attack isn't an assault on the state, the secondary attack on the helper can't be either. The law cannot extend the assault charge to a third party if the primary condition isn't met. You can't have a shadow without the object.
It's logical, sure. But it highlights that if you try to be a good Samaritan, you better hope the bad guy is attacking the cop with serious force, otherwise you're on your own. It requires a layperson to perform a complex legal analysis in the middle of a brawl to know what their level of protection is.
It requires us to have precise definitions so that every street scuffle doesn't result in 12-year prison sentences. The structure of Articles 148, 149, and 151 is designed to categorize the severity of the threat. We can't have emotional rulings. We need statutory boundaries.
I suppose that brings us to the end of the analysis. And I have to say, looking at cases like Tabiana, Veloso, and Macapuno, my takeaway remains the same. The law recognizes, albeit inconsistently, that humans are emotional creatures. We panic, we get frustrated, we resist. The intent to defy is the safety valve. We cannot criminalize passive resistance or a reaction to illegal orders as assault. When we do, we risk turning the law into a weapon of oppression rather than a tool for order. A slap should not always be a felony.
And I see it from the other side. The stability of society rests entirely on the unassailable nature of its agents. Whether it's a teacher in a classroom or a municipal treasurer, Article 148 creates a barrier of sanctity. Cases like Gumbin show us that the state takes the person out of the equation and protects the function. If we allow citizens to physically challenge authority figures because of the heat of the moment, we erode the very authority that keeps society functioning. The law must be a wall, not a suggestion.
And yet, as we've seen, the fate of a defendant might turn on whether they slapped a teacher or punched a cop.
Which is why understanding these distinctions, agents versus persons in authority, serious versus simple disobedience, is so critical for everyone, not just lawyers.
Indeed, it's a complex ecosystem, and the thin blue line is actually a very thick book of statutes.
We invite our listeners to read the source material, specifically the Revised Penal Code, and decide for themselves where that line should be drawn.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time.